Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Empire Builders webinar. We have a great rock star panel for you. My name is Ron Feldman. I'm with ApplePie Capital. And joining me for the first 10 or so minutes of the webinar is going to be Matt Haller as our special guest. Matt is the president and CEO of the International Franchise Association and a huge Wolfpack fan, we just found out, because he went there. We're going to talk about franchisee relevant topics that the IFA is working to protect. And also talk about a couple of things that IFA has done that has really probably helped everyone attending this webinar right now in the past. So Matt, why don't you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about the IFA, and then we'll get into the questions.
Hey, thanks so much, Ron. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. So yeah, like Ron said, I run the International Franchise Association, and our mission is to protect, to enhance, and promote franchising as a business model. And our membership and the issues that we focus on, really supports franchising. And franchising only works when franchisees are making money, and franchise brands can, take that resources and reinvest it in the business to help that business grow. And there's a lot going on in Washington and around the country that impacts both sides of the equation's ability to grow and grow successfully together. So looking forward to some of those issues, both in the past that we've worked on and what we see coming down the pike, and maybe some areas where each and every one of you can get more involved in the IFA.
Thanks. Let's start. Let's go back. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? So when that little thing named COVID hit the country, can you just kind of explain to everyone how PPP was born and ERC was born and what our involvement in that was, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, those were some crazy days there at the beginning of March in 2020. And one of the things that we realized quickly as lawmakers started developing some of the initial thoughts around COVID relief were, how are they going to look at the franchisor-franchisee relationship? And you may have remembered headlines coming out about those bills that were circulating early on. There was language that would have not allowed any franchisee, because of virtue of their connection to a brand, to take advantage of COVID relief. And it was really a 10-day period of time that this $4 trillion piece of legislation ended up being moved through the entire ecosystem of Washington. And IFA, with a lot of support from people like Ron and others, got in there with people like Senator Rubio and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and other key decision makers, and made sure that franchisees were treated, one, as small businesses like they are, but two, were able to take PPP loans and other COVID relief on a location basis. So that was a huge boon, in spite of all the problems that we had to then go clean up with PPP more broadly. But in terms of eligibility, that really only happened because the IFA had a seat at that table, and we're with the right decision makers at the right time. And I always tell people that you need friends in Washington and in other states and cities where we have policy battles before you need them. If you're picking up the phone trying to build a relationship when an issue is at that level, good luck. And otherwise, you're going to be, if you're not at the table, the old adage, you're on the menu. And fortunately, the IFA and our team was at the table, and we were able to shape that COVID relief in a way that very, very much benefited everybody in franchising who took the opportunity to apply for those loans.
You're being very humble. I was on the call with you and Rubio's team. I showed you the notes on my phone from that call where it was born. The idea of a forgivable loan for small businesses to stay afloat was born in a conversation that the IFA was in. So That's probably the most. That's probably got the most zeros of anything that the IFA ever did for franchisees. Let's fast forward now 3 years and talk about the I'll call it the Republic of California, where the challenge was that fast food workers were going to really, well, you explain it. You can do it much more eloquently than I can, and I'll probably drop an F-bomb.
Let's not do that. We know this is being recorded. So California 3 years ago proposed a dramatic increase in the statewide minimum wage for fast food workers, and fast food in their mind is defined as limited or counter service restaurants where people consume the food either through takeout, delivery, or on premise. And that proposal would have increased the minimum wage to $23 an hour, and it would have created a council that had the ability to create workplace standards across the restaurant industry, the limited service restaurant industry. This is effectively creating union standards, but outside a traditional employer union collective bargaining agreement, just creating minimum standards through an unelected bureaucracy. The last component of that original proposal was creating joint liability between franchisors and franchisees, meaning that every franchisor would have been responsible for any labor and employment violations by a franchisee, which we can talk more about joint employer probably in a few minutes. Over the course of about an 18-month lobbying campaign, the IFA was able to mobilize more than 20 million Californians to file a petition so that bill passed the California legislature in 2022, and it was going to go into effect in 2023. IFA was able to mobilize through the California's referendum process 20 million Californians to refer that bill to the full California electorate, whether it should stand or fail. And there were a variety of things that we didn't like about that bill in terms of the cost it would have imposed on the franchisees in the states. And ultimately, what we ended up doing because of that referendum being qualified was entering into negotiation with the governor's office in California, because they knew that we were going to win on the ballot and that bill was not going to stand. And the only reason we got to that table was because of the resources of the franchisee and franchisor community. Through that negotiation, we were able to come to a compromise, which eliminated all of the ability of the council to set those workplace conditions, kind of these unionization standards. We were able to eliminate the joint employer liability threat, and we were able to significantly reduce the prescribed wage increase schedule over a period of the next 4 years in California. So while anybody operating in California is still facing, a 25% wage increase that went into effect in April 1st. Not a good outcome, but I think you always have to look at these things, one, in the political context of a state like California, where the business community does not typically have a lot of ability to influence policy, and two, the alternative of what was in this original bill that the legislature signed into law and sent to the governor. So, not a full victory, but a major savings to anybody operating in California. And now something that the union SEIU is intending to take to other states around the country as part of their strategy.
Yeah, I mean, that was perilous. You talked about joint employer. I don't know how many franchisees understand how it affects them. We know how it affects franchisors. Franchisors don't want to be liable for Lisa or Antonio's employees, problems. It breaks the model because they couldn't survive on the royalties that they're collecting if they had that liability. But what does it do? I'm a franchisee. Lisa and Antonio both have some debt. They'll talk about that soon. They personally guaranteed that debt. And what does joint employer make them?
Well, in effect, it converts Antonia and Lisa into employees of the brands with which they've decided to partner with through their franchise agreement. And I mean, I say this every time I speak to franchisees. Tell me a franchisee that wants their franchisor more involved in their business, and you'll get no hands raising in the room. So I can't see the room here. I can see Antonio on my screen shaking his head no. So that is the effect of an expanded definition of joint employment, as has been put forward by the Biden administration's National Labor Relations Board, as was on the table in California. And if government changes the rules in the middle of the game, franchisors are forced to change their business model. If they're going to now be forced to have all of the liability of a restaurant or a retail business, then they are going to say, move over, I'll drive. The other option is they back off and they stop providing, different types of support and services to franchisees that, oh, by the way, you've paid a royalty for and other fees for over the course of that relationship. And it's the whole reason you're in a franchise relationship in the first place, is to get that operational marketing and other support from a brand. So it cuts right at the heart of the franchise business model. And it's just this blunt instrument that organized labor has concocted to, at the end of the day, help support their dwindling union membership strategy in the private sector. And I always use the analogy of, why do bank robbers rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. Well, why do unions want to target the franchise model? It's where the jobs are. It's where the growth is. So we are unfortunately collateral damage in unions' aggressive growth strategy. And we need collective action through our industry and through our grassroots and engagement to help tell the story of why franchising works and the separation between the brands and franchisees works. It works for workers. Joint employer is anti-worker, it's anti-franchise. And that's the story that we need to continue to get out there to push back on this push by organized labor.
So we have about 2 minutes left, you and I, and then we got to let the rock stars take over here. We have a slide up now. Everyone on this call, please join the Franchise Action Network. You'll get a copy of this deck from Judah, and there's a hyperlink to join it. Then you'll start getting texts that it's so easy. If you get a text saying, send this to your senator, send this to your congressperson, it knows where you live. It automatically sends the stuff. Get engaged, get involved. You should join the IFA. We need more franchisees as members of the IFA. We have a lot of franchisor members, and some franchisors, automatically have their franchisees join. If yours doesn't, you should join. And this is the third bullet. I can't tell you the experience that you would have this September coming into DC and going up on Capitol Hill and meeting with your legislators and their staff. It will make you feel like you're doing your civic duty in no other way, much better than voting, because you're actually using your voice, not just your vote. And we're the next slide. And please bring this up and talk it up in your franchisee communities. There's a QR code for you to register for this summit. It's in a really nice hotel that's right next to the White House practically. And we have speakers that are very, very relevant to your business. Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that for those that might feel like this is daunting, we do what we call advocacy training. So we teach you, how to conduct yourself in a meeting with a member of Congress or their aides, and talk about the issues that we're going to go up to Capitol Hill to talk about. It'll be things like the joint employer issue, things like there's a big tax cliff coming in 2025 that we didn't have time to fully dive into here, but that will impact the equity value of every franchisee who's set up as a pass-through entity in this country. So that's going to be a big focus of ours. And it's a heck of a lot of fun. We have a great party that we throw at the end of the advocacy summit that School of Rock has done with us the last 2 years, and we have members of Congress come and play music in a bipartisan band. And you get to go up to the Hill with other members of the franchisee and franchisor community from your states. And we do all the work to schedule the meetings for you with your 2 senators and your members of Congress. So it's really a great thing. And I'll just put in a last plug for me or a member of my government affairs team to speak to any of your franchisee associations or FACs via Zoom, or come out and do 30 minutes at a future meeting in person. So I appreciate the opportunity, Ron, and team at ApplePie. And if we can answer any questions, feel free to reach out to me at mhaller@franchise.org. And hope you guys have a good rest of the webinar here with your 2 rock stars.
Thanks, Matt. And how many CEOs just announced their email address to everybody? Thank you for being so accessible. Thank you for being a great leader. It's not unappreciated. You've got me for life as a volunteer. So I keep getting drafted into these things, but it's a labor of love for me. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Samantha Holt from ApplePie and our 2 panelists, and they will take over.
Thanks, Ron, and thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. And as Ron said, my name's Samantha Holt. I manage sales operations and our team of relationship managers at ApplePie. I'm very excited to introduce you to our 2 panelists today. We have Antonio McBroom. He's the one in the bright pink bow tie, in case you missed him. Antonio is a multi-unit franchisee with Ben & Jerry's, also has some experience in the Starbucks brand. He's been with Ben & Jerry's, a system that he started as a manager in for over a decade now, and eventually ended up buying the original location he worked at. So that's sort of his journey, how his journey began as a franchise owner. We also have Lisa Schiller, who has a different story. She's a multi-unit franchisee with 10 total units across European Wax Center and Restore Hyper Wellness. So Lisa's a recovering lawyer turned franchise owner. So we've got 2 very different paths to success here, both of which I'm sure come with their own distinct set of challenges and insight that they are going to share today. So when it comes to scaling any business, there are obviously a lot of variables to manage and several ways to take on all of those variables. So I want to start by talking about the big one, which is capital, but not just financial capital. I'd want to start with the human capital aspect of it, which in a lot of ways I think is more difficult to master and something that becomes more important the more units you have. So I'm curious for both of you, because I know your growth happened within different timelines. At what point did you realize that you needed to add another layer of management, and how did you go about starting to build out that infrastructure?
Antonio, you want to start?
Ladies first. I'm a Southern gentleman, Lisa.
All right, I know. Well, thank you, Samantha. Hi, everyone. So for me, we had my European wax centers were a little different, but in both concepts, I had a very quick expansion. I started with 1 franchise with European Wax Center. I bought 1 license. I was building 1 store, and corporate reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to buy 2 operating stores. And I did. And I essentially opened 3 stores within a month of each other, having no idea what I was doing, by the way. But I realized pretty quickly with that franchise that obviously I needed managers in each store, but I chose early on, even though I did not really have the capital to do this, because I'm doing those by myself. I don't have partners in that I needed a district manager overseeing all 3 centers, because I learned that, I didn't want to work in my business because then I couldn't work on my business. So I needed somebody to oversee those 3 centers, and somebody that knew what they were doing, because I didn't at that point. I knew a lot about the law, but I didn't know a lot about operating a European Wax Center. So that happened, and it worked out really well. And then with Restore Hyper Wellness, the same sort of thing happened. We expanded very quickly, not by choice, and we're going to get into this a little later. This was more by opportunity that the expansion happened. But we figured out after our first 2 stores, actually, I shouldn't say that. We figured out after our first 4 stores that we needed like a director of operations. Because in that case, I have partners, but the 3 of us, have jobs and we're doing other things, and we needed somebody to oversee those stores. So at store number 5 and 6 was when we brought in a director of operations. And so that's kind of like how that happened.
Awesome. And I'll piggyback. We had a really similar journey in ways, Lisa. I had a handful of times where I realized that I needed to kind of level up my management. And the first started with my first unit, when I was still a single unit operator, but we were improving our sales. I started seeing these new channels, such as the off-premise and catering business, the ice cream cake business, and then our community activism that needed a person to take some ownership. And so members of my staff started to just kind of step up into roles to where they were managing these little subunits within the one unit that we had. And so then the next time was whenever we went from 1 unit to 2. So we were operating in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and we bought our second unit in Greensboro, North Carolina. But kind of mathematical magic happened. I went from 1 unit and I added a unit, but I ended up with 3 units because the off-premise and catering business from the 2 became substantial enough that it needed a manager and it had volume that made it its own unit. And so that's where I really had my first full management team, right? I've got 3 adults. It's no longer just college students and part-time, it's I've got 3 adults, and each person has a part of the business that they're really responsible for. The next time became whenever it was time to expand geography. So we were operating these 2 stores in North Carolina successfully. And a few years later, we decided to expand into Atlanta, Georgia. And, I quickly realized I couldn't clone myself and be 2 places at once. And I bought in an operating partner to just basically replicate what I was doing in North Carolina, but down in Georgia. And that worked well for several years. And the next point became whenever we stumbled upon the EOS entrepreneurial operating system, where we started to see like, okay, it's cool to do this. I'm in this region, you're in that region. We're doing, a little bit of everything in every region. But as we started to scale into, more than 3 units, we learned about EOS, and we learned that, hey, it'd be a good idea if I do what I do really well, but I do it for both markets. And my partner, Philip, he does what he does really well, but he do it for both markets. And so that allowed us kind of this framework to start scaling from 3 and start approaching double-digit units. And I'd say as we got close to double-digit units, that's where the final learning came for us, which was, okay, now we need to think about that district manager in each of the different regions that we're in, as Lisa mentioned earlier. And we also saw that it's a good idea as you start to get, more than 7 units, it's a good idea to have a bench manager, right? And it's just kind of this built-in person that is ready to step into a unit should you have a unit leader do a transition on you. So, handful of times where at each time a different situation called for us leveling up our management and human capital.
Thanks, Antonio and Lisa. It sounds like for Antonio, for you did more, and maybe it's similar for Lisa, I'm curious, but you are used to building a bench, like you mentioned, and a lot of your growth happens sort of with identifying people within that were already working for you and figuring out their strengths and putting them in a management position. I think, Lisa, it sounds like yours happened a little bit quicker, where you realized right away that you might need some additional help. Did you take a similar approach, or were you sort of hiring outside of the units as far as identifying who would be good for those management positions?
Well, for me, with European Wax Center, I got very lucky. I got a corporate manager from European Wax Center. She jumped ship from corporate and came to me because she sort of saw the writing on the wall. Corporate was selling off their units, whatever operating units they had, they were selling. They still have a few, don't get me wrong, but in the South Florida region. And so she jumped ship, found me and said, hey, can I, come work for you? So that's how my district manager happened with European Wax Center. And then with regard to promoting from within, I do like to try to identify people that have been working, inside the store, probably for me, European Wax, it would be a GSA or a guest service associate that elevates up. I also elevate people on the esthetician side, you know, to peer trainers. So I have that structure now. I have peer trainers for each segment of that business. So for the guest service associates, I have a peer trainer. For the waxers, I have a peer trainer in each store. For Restore Hyper Wellness, it was a little bit similar to Antonio. For our first 2 stores, we have operating partners. So, and they're still there and they own a percentage. They bought in and it worked. It worked. They are rock stars and they operate those stores, and they're like, those 2 stores are an island to themselves. So for some people in the world that are thinking about franchising, that's something to think about. Like, can I bring in somebody that is willing to work, you know, at the store level in operations, has the money to invest, and so therefore has skin in the game? We tried that. We tried to implement that at our other stores, but it doesn't always work. So just, you know, FYI, we got very lucky with our first 2 partners, but with the other 4 stores, we didn't get so lucky. We tried, and this would go later to your question, Samantha, about what's one thing that you did that you regret doing. Was thinking we could replicate that at each store. Each store is its own entity, and each store in every city has a different vibe, and you know, so it didn't work so well. We tried it, it didn't work. We ended up buying out those operating partners, and now we have managers. But now going back to your question, we do like to try to elevate from within. So maybe from a wellness coordinator up to an assistant manager, ultimately up to manager. Doesn't always work either. We have hired from outside. It's difficult because you have to always also remember that, you know, each franchise and every business is different, right? They have to learn the business, and they have to have management experience. And then thirdly, they have to be able to sell. And if they can't sell, those first 2 things are great, but you're not going to make any money. So they might be able to manage really well, but if they're scared to sell, or they're scared to coach their teams to sell, or let's call it educate on our product or our service, then, you know, the business will suffer. I mean, 100%. So the team is really important, and therefore deciding how to build that team is probably your number 1 priority.
Figuring out how to determine when it works versus when it doesn't, it sounds like.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah. Don't hang on too long if it's not working. I mean, it stinks because you know, it costs money to hire and fire and hire and fire, but it costs a lot more money to just hang on to dead weight, you know? So.
Well,
Yeah.
speaking of money, I do want to switch gears to the other side of the capital equation, which is the financial capital, right? So it sounds like you have been, at least you, Lisa, I'm not sure about your situation, Antonio, but in the scenario where you had several units opening in a short period of time, how did you approach the financing of those? And knowing what you know now, would you have done it differently at all?
Yeah, I learned a lot about scaling and the financing side the hard way. You know, I'm sure we've all heard the saying, cash is king. And if you take that into the game of chess, I like to say cash is king, but cash flow is queen. And when I've first started scaling, I didn't really prioritize purchasing cash flow and really factoring that into my equation when I was growing. And, you know, and I also was so focused on price that, you know, if it was a deal that was very cash intensive and it had to happen fast, but I was going to have to tie up a lot of cash and not be able to go through the proper channels of financing, you know, I would do it. And it would literally, you know, cripple my cash position for years. So that was one of the learnings. The other was, as we got going with scaling, starting to realize that it's time, you know, when you get the idea and start doing the due diligence of hiring a lawyer, of getting financial services, of doing training and traveling for units, you know, that starts the project cost right there. And so not just once you've signed the lease and have already expended over $50,000 or so, you know, I think it starts at day one whenever you first start. And so starting to build that into my project costs and seeking financing early was one of those difference makers that allowed me to start purchasing units in much more efficient and faster order.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, just looking holistically at the project cost versus just how much is my construction, or kind of having this number in your head. It starts a lot earlier than you think. And then you plan for sometimes. Lisa, what about you? I think you said you had 3 units sort of all around at the same time. What challenges did you have with that?
Oh, that was fun. Well, back then, because I was a brand new business owner, and so for anyone that's thinking about jumping into the, franchise world, I was a very successful lawyer for 25, giving away my age, but like 25 years, right? And decided to jump off into the franchise world. So, I didn't know what it took to get, this type of loan. So back then I couldn't get a conventional loan, or in this case, ApplePie capital loan. And so I had to start with the SBA, which, anybody that's thinking about this, just be prepared, because it is document intensive. But it required, back then I had to put down, I think the SBA's requirements were, let's say, 20%. But what the SBA required was for me to do a forecasted business plan to, determine how much they were willing to lend. They require collateral. I had to give my house as finance, as collateral at that time. So that's kind of how that started. How I got it done, I don't know. I got them to finance. I think I just had a really good lender at the time that just really went to bat for me, which I would add is, kind of piggybacking on what Antonio said, determining early on what your projections are and what your loan is going to be, I think is very helpful if you have a great lender that is, not your partner per se, but your partner in the game, right? Like, so they will help you. So when we switched over and we finally, we became successful enough to have ApplePie Capital be our lender, my loan officer, Travis, he was extremely helpful in helping me put together a business plan as to what my costs were going to be to build this store from scratch, which included, as Antonio said, the lawyer fee, the legal fees for negotiating the lease, the architect fees, the, deposit and first month's rent, the build out, but then all the other things that we don't always think about, which are, payroll costs to hire somebody to go out and do pre-sales for us, to build this, to put the store together, to, do the interviews, all of these things that you don't know when you open store number 1. And as you scale, you start to, some of it's a learning experience, but for us, our lender was very helpful. So I would, say to anybody wanting to do this, like, definitely see if you can find a business plan similar to the type of business you're thinking about, and then talk to your lender and, make sure you're not missing anything, because your lender will know things like you're forgetting this cost and you're forgetting that cost, to determine how much financing you really need ultimately.
Right. And sharing your plan with them so they can maybe stop you from like, here's what we would finance and what we wouldn't, and then making the decision, do you have the capital personally to fill in the gaps, right? If your schedule maybe is a little bit more aggressive than what the lender is willing to do. I think that's important also.
Hey, Sam, I got a really great question from one of our guests, Ed Grimes. I'm just going to read it because it's really great. My wife and I are franchisees for Scooter's Coffee. They're great. We've signed up for multiple units. We have opened only one so far. It's coming up on 1 year open this July. It's been a struggle. We're seeing incremental sales growth, which is awesome. However, it's going to take a while to get to positive cash flow. We're struggling with when to go ahead and start the process to open a second store. Can you speak to that a little bit? I think that's a great question.
Great question. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Who wants to take it?
I think, year 1, you're still learning, especially with this being your first unit. So giving yourself a little bit of grace period to, clear year 1. That usually around that 18-month clip is where you've really figured out some systems. You've gotten some experience and went through multiple seasons. And that's the point where I think that, ideation around unit number 2 can really take form. That's when you'll also start closing on having 2 years worth of business financials to go off of, right? And I think that, my experience has been, mastering that single unit economics before you replicate it is really key. Our business typically scales in a cycle of 3 years. Our first unit, we really honed in on it for 3 straight years. And then that's when we hit the ground really running for scale and for going for the second unit. And then over time, as you get the systems in place and you build the human capital, you build the relationships on the financing side, because it's a who not how game. I think you can get 99 no's, but as long as you get 1 yes, when it's time to build your second unit, that's what counts. And to Lisa's point, it may be a SBA acquisition that you do in the early days. You want to do that, time it wisely and do it right, but give yourself some grace to really get the first unit stable.
I agree with that 100%. If you have the luxury, which it sounds like, Ed, you do, if you have the luxury to wait till you've really, got your first unit up running and maybe throwing off a tiny bit of profits, but the systems, you've got it down. So it's just kind of like rinse and repeat in a way. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but I didn't have that luxury. We developed so fast. And like I said, not because of not out of choice, but more out of opportunity. Opportunities presented themselves and we just had to take them. And so our struggle, it's a big struggle for us financially. We're getting through it, but if you can wait and then, when you're comfortable, like Antonio said, 18 months or so, start store number 2, unless of course you find the perfect piece of real estate, like to lease, in a plaza. That happens too. Like something pops up and you just can't let it go because it's just in the perfect spot, you just got to jump on it. But otherwise,
Sometimes
I think
your timeline is not your own.
right. Exactly. So it's opportunity and not choice,
Yeah.
So
Awesome. Great question. This is sort of on the same topic, and maybe fast forwarding a little bit to someone who's on the other end of that spectrum, maybe in the 5 to 10 unit phase of their growth. And when it comes to knowing your numbers and analyzing your financials, how do you approach that? And meaning like how often and what do you look for red flags? And have you had to make a tough decision on a location that maybe isn't doing so well? How do you recommend deciding how much time, effort, and money to put into a location that isn't performing before you maybe say this one's not a winner? And how do you go about deciding that?
oof.
Yeah, I've been there for sure, Sam. So 2021, we had a mall location, this little 200 square foot kiosk that was paying double the rent of any of my other locations. And it was already struggling before COVID. So interior mall post-pandemic really, really struggled. And, we had to make that difficult decision to close our first unit. And, it was tough because this was a unit that I poured my money into, I poured my heart into. It was close to home. So it was kind of like, I go to church and we normally stop by this unit right after. So it's a little ego involved, but financially it was the right thing to do. And I needed to take that level of responsibility for my business so that we could focus on the units that are profitable and focus on finding those next units that, as the world had evolved into kind of new mixed use, live, work, eat, play, outdoor stuff. Like let's find that location. And so that was a tough one. And then most recently, I had a 2-store acquisition in Charlotte, North Carolina. And in one side, I was buying the busiest store in the state, and on the other side, it was the slowest store in the state. And just kind of making that decision from day one that this store that's not profitable now, we don't see it being profitable. That general part of town is not pedestrian friendly right now, and let's just pull the plug and pay a termination fee at closing so we don't spend the time on that. And what we've saw, just quick results, is a lot of the clientele that we built up at that store finding their way to the main unit, and so it's getting busier, and we're getting more efficiency under that one roof, just having the one business. And so we've been that route twice, and each time it was a very tough decision to make. But I think when you look at unit economics, multi-unit all boils down to unit economics and unit leadership. And when you look at a unit's economics and it doesn't work, it's the right thing to do to pull the plug.
Sure. It's not a failure if it's a gain in efficiency and it allows you to grow faster. What about you, Lisa? You were shaking your head. I feel like you maybe have a similar scenario.
Well, yeah, I mean, we haven't closed anything yet, but man, we've funded a lot. So, you know, again, my wax centers, I mean, that is just a great franchise, and not that Restore isn't, but it's a baby franchise. European Wax is a very well established. So there's that part of the sort of thought process when someone's thinking about, oh, what, you know, maybe what enterprise to jump into. I liked European Wax. I got in later, you know, I've only been in a little bit over 5 years, but it was such a well-established name that I didn't have to worry about people going, what is European Wax Center? Everyone knew what it was. So, you know, the brand was established. And so I just had to focus on my units, you know, specifically. With Restore, it's a little bit more difficult because, you know, we were like the 7th franchise group into the network. No one knew what Restore was. And it's like cutting edge services, becoming much more mainstream now, of course. But, you know, to Antonio's point, you know, we have stores that, you know, are great. I mean, they are like super profitable, and the ones that have the 2 operating partners in that are just, you know, they're rock stars. But, you know, our newer units, we just opened 2 back to back, and they are very expensive units to open. So we haven't gotten to that point that Antonio just talked about. I mean, it would be very tragic for us to close a store because we are guarantors on the leases and the loans. So that would be a very, very difficult decision. So what we do, Sam, is we just keep funding the store. One of the benefits, and I would recommend this to everyone, that's obviously people that are already, you know, with units probably already know this, but try to negotiate the best TI return you can from your landlord, because when we get that $165,000 check from our landlord, oh man, that's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. So that helps to, you know, fund, I guess we'll call it. But it also depends on your lender, because SBA, they're taking that money. ApplePie Capital, they're a little more lenient with how we use our TI dollars, but obviously we're reporting to them all the time where our money's going. But we haven't closed anything yet. But I definitely agree with Antonio's, like, you know, point on that. Like, just don't hang on to the ones that are dragging the rest of your stores down. Just, you know, cut them loose, I guess, if you have that ability to do so, and focus on the winners.
And to Lisa's point, you know, that when you sign a lease, to the degree possible, try to limit exposure. You know, if possible, do a guarantee. But as you get multi-units, see if you can do a guarantee with one of your other existing units versus a personal guarantee. So that kind of cross-corporate guarantee, or see if you could do an additional month's deposit and limit the guarantee so that it's only, you know, it's got a cap on it. It's got a finite cap. If to the degree possible, limiting the number of times you sign unconditional guarantees with landlords as you get into multi-unit is really, really helpful, because you just never know what happens across multiple units. I think about my advisor, Sandy Julius, I had with Ben & Jerry's Corporate when we started really scaling units. And she used the analogy of children. She's like, all right, Antonio, you've had this one unit and it's like your baby and you spoiled it, right? And now you've went to 2, and with 2 children, you can manage. But now as you start getting into 3+, you've got to have a system. And that's where she, you know, really encouraged me with one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd like to give anyone who's looking at, you know, really scaling up to 10 units is, just like our phones and our computers all have a operating system behind them, your business, as you start to really scale it, needs a operating system behind it. And I mentioned earlier, Traction, or the entrepreneurial operating system, is one that we found early on. There are other operating systems. Scaling Up itself is the name of an operating system, as well as the 4 disciplines of execution, or 4DX. But I'd say that's a major major opportunity to just kind of create a system that will allow you to weather some of the storms that come from if you end up with a unit that's not performing or meeting expectations, but also gives you a framework to really build a strong and robust business.
Thanks, Antonio and Lisa. There's a lot of good questions in the Q&A, and I want to leave time for them, but I have at least one or two more for the two of you that I think are important. And you've sort of alluded to this earlier on, but since hindsight's 2020, what is the biggest mistake that you've made since you started growing your business, whether it's related to partners or financing or whatever the case? What, if you had to pick one thing, what's one thing you'd do over?
Well, for me, I would, if I had the choice, I wouldn't have expanded so quickly. But again, so for those out there that have the luxury of, time, I would absolutely take that luxury. We just didn't because of the opportunities that were presented to us, or we would have lost those opportunities. So in that case, I don't know that I can do it differently, but if I had the opportunity to do it differently, I would. And then, of course, the partners, just be very careful who you bring in as a partner, because you may be stuck with them for a long time. So
that's a good one, Lisa. I think for me, it was, I was so price conscious on everything and frugal. And I would like argue over pennies and miss real dollars. And early on in my journey, I had a chance to do an acquisition really close to me. And I passed on it over, we couldn't agree on price over $20,000, right? And this ended up leading to that unit getting sold to someone else, and just this 5-year disaster of arguing and territory, and you would think I learned my lesson, right? And then I did it again down the road, where it was this great unit. The seller had a certain value on it. I had a certain value on it. And, I passed on it. And fortunately with that one, it recircled my way 3 years down the road, and I was able to do the deal. And it's now one of my top performing units, right? It really opened things up for us in terms of just how successful it is. But I look in the mirror sometimes like, yeah, I really made the decision to pass on that over just a few pennies, right? And I almost did it a third time. But fortunately, I've kind of learned my lesson around that. But that was kind of one of my bigger mistakes, is just focusing so much on price versus what I mentioned earlier. Cash is king, cash flow is queen. And if you can, pay a little higher price, but structure the deal where there's a seller note, or where it's going to be substantially incremental cash flow even after you service your debt and do the investment, it's a winning deal, right? So that's my biggest mistake I think I made in the past.
Yeah, there's a phrase that I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's something like a penny saved is a penny. So like you save pennies, but you lose dollars. So that's a great perspective.
Sam, the only other thing I would add is, and this depends on whatever everybody's goal is, like for us, one of our goals with Restore, because we got in so early, so we were lucky to be in early, is we, owning, depending on your future plans, because I know that's one of your questions, is what's your, what is your end game, basically. Like for us, to our end game, and I would think most people's, is to sell all your units and to own a territory, or like more than one store, multi-units, is always adds, I have heard and learned that it adds value to the units, because maybe private equity groups come in, they don't want just one unit, they want to add it to their portfolio, and they want multiple units. So something to think about, like as people are going through the process, and do I want 1 unit, 5 units, 3 units, can I scale? Just that thought of maybe think about what your long-term plan is before deciding how many units to acquire, or maybe how many units not to acquire, something along those lines. Or as Antonio said, like, rejecting something over, 10 or 20 grand versus bringing it into your portfolio for, the potential future value.
Yeah, thanks for making my segue easy, Lisa. I think
Anytime, girl.
Yeah, I mean, you have to begin with the end in sight. So if you don't mind sharing, I know Lisa, you just shared a little bit. When it comes to you, Antonio, what are your long-term plans, and have you thought about like your exit plan or your end goal with all of this?
You know, I look up and see that I've been doing Ben and Jerry's 100% of my adult life, 20 years straight. And I still feel like I'm just getting started with it. That said, if you don't have a kind of, plan in place, then you're missing the mark in terms of an investment. We all do wills and estate planning. Not that we hope to die, but at some point, you will exit your business in one way or another, whether it's through death, whether it's through passing it to a family member, selling it to someone who works inside, selling it to someone external, right? And so I think that there's value created by actually just spending the time of putting yourself on the other side of the table and asking the simple question of, if I were to repurchase this business as it stands, what would make it more valuable for me? And going through the exercise of doing that, and doing the things that you need to maybe strengthen your leases as it comes time for renewals, or document processes, right? And get what's in your head and what you know how to do, get that down on paper. All of this stuff adds tangible value for your business. And so we've really prioritized doing that. We haven't thought about any sort of exit. But I did recently read a book called Dancing in the End Zone that I thought was really, really cool about this topic. So anybody who wants to learn more on exit planning, I suggest you read the book Dancing in the End Zone. It talks about, in football, the first person who scored a touchdown and actually did like a celebration dance in the end zone, right? And how they want all business owners to be able to dance in the end zone when it's all said and done with you and your business. So I think an exit plan is the first step. Is kind of like the rehearsal for being able to dance in the end zone one day.
Awesome. We do have a list of recommended reading at the end. I'll save that for the end, but I think that might be on there. So good suggestion. So ending on a positive note, and then we can maybe answer a question or two. I know it's a lot more than just one thing, but if you had to choose one thing to do right, what advice would you give someone in the earlier stages of growing their franchise?
One thing to do right?
Yep.
I would say focus on, with the assumption you want to do multi-units. One unit's a little easier, but with the assumption you want to scale, as we've been saying, I would say build culture, build processes, get those in place, try to understand your business, and then start to scale if you have that luxury. But processes, culture, and building a team are I think the key. And then try to repeat that unit after unit after unit.
Awesome.
Ditto, Lisa. Ditto. Prioritizing people and culture is the best decision that I've made, and making sure that you actually create both time budget and money budget for leader development and org development, making it like a tier 1 budget item, not one of those things that gets cut. And I'm sure you've heard of this concept of kind of the 80-20 rule, but it really applies to your team. There's 20% of the people that work for you that deliver 80% of the results, and really identifying that top 20, top tier talent and focusing in on that talent's development and their performance is key. That's been the best decision I've made.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you guys. Jamie, there's a couple, I know you've answered a lot. There's one question in the chat that's kind of on this topic, but I'll leave it to you if you think there's others that we should raise too.
Yeah, I think we got time to answer each of the questions that are in there, Sam. If you want to go ahead and do that, that's great.
Yeah, this is sort of related to what you just said, Antonio. This is from Jebby Matthew. He wants to ask how you decided payment and compensation structure for the managers you made it go away, but that's okay. How did you decide the payment and compensation structure for people as they're growing with you?
We really promote a culture of earning and performance. So it's just natural for us to have a strong base compensation that's competitive, but also share in the earnings of the business and motivate our our unit managers to, when we make money as a business, they make more money through driving sales, through managing the unit economics, and managing culture. So that's been a big piece for us. And I'd encourage anyone to think about having a performance component in addition to, base salaries, just to make sure your folks are motivated to get outcomes that you want as a business owner.
Great, 100%. You've got to have a performance part of your compensation needs to be performance based, because I'd like to think everybody just loves our business and wants it to be as successful as we do, but the reality is everyone's motivated by cash. So as Antonio says, cash is king, and what's the other thing is queen? Cash flow is queen. But yeah, I would, we offer depending on experience that the person comes with, or if they are being, elevated within the business, we offer the base salary towards, their management salary. And then we do have a performance-based part of it, which is generally tied to revenues of the store. And so, and then we also, within the teams, we have different comp structures as well that are somewhat performance-based, depending on, who it is, whether it's the estheticians at Restore, or for me at the wax centers, everything is performance-based. They all make a bonus, but I have 4 different buckets that they can bonus from. And they're always striving for those bonuses. So I would definitely recommend that.
Perfect.
Another great question from Edward Grimes, related to scaling up and working on the business versus in the business. And so he asks, another question we have does go to management. My wife and I are working in the business while also carving out to work on the time to work on the business. We're considering making a change to store management and being even more involved at the store. There are multiple factors, and one of which is to save on labor for a while. What do you think of this?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I guess again, that goes to whether or not, I mean, if you have one store right now, and and you guys don't mind working in there, then I think it's great. Like, if I could work in my store, I guarantee you the sales would double, but I can't do that. So if you have the luxury to do that, that's great. But when you start to scale, because I know you guys were looking at scaling, I think it becomes difficult to do it all. So at some point, I think you have to start to trust your team members, elevate somebody, or find somebody that you trust enough to to manage, so that you guys can go out there and like start to strategize on your development more. I know it's lovely. I love saving on payroll costs. That's key, and you guys will probably do a better job than anyone, but at some point when you're scaling, you'll find it difficult to do it all, I think.
Any further thoughts on that, Antonio?
I was just going to say, I can empathize because, I actually love working in my shops. I love scooping ice cream. But as I thought about scale, I had to literally get my head out of the dip case. And so anytime I go put my head back in the dip case, it is for short periods of time for a specific purpose to take a unit from X to Y and build a team there. And I think, if you and your wife are thinking about scaling more, maybe taking that same approach, maybe getting back in and getting more involved in the shop, it's going to grow the sales, create the systems, create the guest experience that you want. But look at it as a kind of short-term, not long-term solution as you look to grow and scale the business.
Wonderful. Very good. There's one more quick question if we have time, and that is, what made you select closing the business versus selling it? I think that was to you, Antonio.
Yeah, I've learned my lesson. In my business, proximity actually, makes a difference. And I've sold businesses before that are in areas where we're not looking to continue to grow and develop. This particular unit that I closed was literally right down the road from my church and where I live and where I've got other stores. And so selling it to someone wasn't best for me. And it also wasn't best for the brand. It was a struggling unit that truthfully, anybody who was going to operate it was going to have a hard time. And so I did all I could to save it, by renegotiating some stuff with the landlord. But when it boiled down to it, I didn't think it was in the brand's best interest or our best interest to keep it going, and we chose to close it.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for all the responses. Sam, you want to wrap this up? I think
I
there are no more questions in the Q&A, so we got everything
Look at
answered
that.
for everybody.
Almost perfect timing. We are going to send this deck out to everybody who is registered. So even people who might have registered that didn't end up attending or dropped off a little bit early. This slide will be in there. Antonio, anything special you want to say about any of these recommended books?
Nothing special. I mentioned each of them except maybe culture by design. That's as you start to scale and you really want to keep the same culture that you had in that first unit. As Lisa mentioned, you know, getting an operating partner early on is kind of easy. My first operating partner, Philip, you know, my mom taught him first grade, and his dad was my barber for life. So we had the same core values, and he could go to Atlanta and do exactly what I wanted done. As we started scaling more, though, our culture needed to actually be documented. It couldn't just be this thing that was understood. And so culture by design is one of these things that will allow you to start to really document culture for the business, the multi-unit franchise that you're building, so that as you get multiple units, that same culture that was there in that first unit can be present everywhere.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you for that. Thanks for sharing these. And both of you, Lisa, Antonio, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know you, as we all heard, are very busy individuals, so we appreciate you spending an hour with everybody here. Ron, thanks so much for your input. I think Matt might have dropped off, but I'll say thanks to him for the recording. So thanks, everybody. We will send this out, I think later today, maybe tomorrow. Judah would know better. If you have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to any one of us. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Great
Bye.
job.
Thank you.